One muggy July day in 2018, I was standing by the side of a major highway in Mumbai. My team and I were there as part of our startup venture, Sulis. We had a pilot program going, and our mission was to make lack of access to clean water a thing of the past. On that particular day, we spent hours talking with the woman seen seated here, Daksha. Daksha, like 300 million other Indians, lacks access to safe water. Every day, she is forced to rely on the contaminated water in her slum for drinking, bathing, and washing clothes. Today, Daksha suffers from skin infections and diarrhea, but in the long run, she will likely experience severe kidney and liver-related disease. On that muggy July day, Daksha looked at me and asked, "How are you going to address my problem?" And in that moment, my mind went blank. All I could think about was, man, I better not screw this up. But failure to me in that moment was not an inability to produce a solution or a technology, because I knew that our team could do that. No, the fear that I felt in that moment, and the one that stayed with me for months after I returned from India, was that ultimately my team would be able to develop a product, but that product would cause all types of other problems that I could not foresee. And in the end, our attempt to address lack of access to clean water, though pure in intent, would have an unfortunate impact on Daksha and families like Daksha's. Flash forward to the summer of 2019, and I'm sitting in a cool, air-conditioned co-working space in New York City. I'm there to attend a summit, which is for students interested in the intersection between technology and social impact work. I decide I'm going to go to a breakout session, which is facetiously titled, "How to Harm the World with Your Startup." And it's being led by the great mathematician and entrepreneur, Spencer Greenberg. As I'm sitting in on this breakout session, which is specifically targeting startups and entrepreneurs, I have the realization that the messaging of the presentation and the fear that I felt while talking to Daksha were actually not unique to me or to entrepreneurs at all. My fear stemmed from something I call the intention-impact gap. The intention-impact gap is the universal human phenomenon of entering a situation with the intention of doing X and then having the resulting impact of Y. I think it's really easy to understand the intention-impact gap on an interpersonal level. Just think about the last time you had a conversation or an interaction with a colleague or friend in passing, and you made an unassuming comment, only to be met completely off guard and taken off guard by their response. Something to the extent of, "Hi, Linda, oh my God, when are you due?" Only to realize that Linda is not pregnant. Brutal, but we've all been there. So that's the intention-impact gap on an interpersonal level. But how does the intention-impact gap play out on a larger scale if we zoom out? Well, if you really think about it, our nation's opioid crisis was enabled by thousands of well-intentioned health professionals who were being pressured to prescribe medication that was highly addictive. If those dentists and doctors had thought a little bit more about the unintended consequences of overprescribing those drugs, our nation would not be facing the crisis that we currently are. So clearly, the intention-impact gap is not a uniquely entrepreneurial issue. But that being said, I have found that business and social entrepreneurship specifically can serve as a really great case study with which we can understand the common pitfalls as we as individuals and as humans should be avoiding and how we can go about avoiding them. In order to fully understand the life cycle of the intention-impact gap, we need to look at a company that's been around long enough to create some serious impact. So by a show of hands, how many of us in the audience today have heard of Tom's Shoes? Many of us, which makes sense. It's a pretty popular brand. As of 2020, Tom's Shoes is valued at over $600 million. But back in 2006, Blake Mykowski founded Tom's Shoes after a single visit to Argentina. While in Argentina, he witnessed thousands of children walking around the streets barefoot, and it deeply bothered Blake. He decided he couldn't sit back and just let this happen. He needed to do something to address the shoelessness problem. So, like many entrepreneurs, Blake went back to California, had his aha moment, and developed Tom's Shoes, which many of us know from their famous one-for-one model. The idea being someone like you or me purchases a pair of Tom's shoes, and then one pair gets donated to a child in need. According to the 2019 giving report that Tom's put out, the company's been able to give out 95 million pairs of shoes to people in need. So it's a great company, great concept. What's the issue? Well, since Tom's was founded in 2006, it's come under criticism for several issues, and I'd like to discuss two of those criticisms with you all today. The first criticism that Tom's faced was that it was crippling local economies and building economic dependencies. You see, even in countries like Argentina, there are people whose job it is to make and manufacture shoes. Now imagine that you're that Argentinian shoemaker in a small village, and now, out of nowhere, a massive American company has started to dump tons and tons of free shoes into your community. Well, it looks like your trade is no longer needed. That is the impact of a flooded market. It pushes people who are working in those industries out of their jobs. So that's criticism number one, negative economic impact. The second criticism that Tom's shoes faced was that pertained to specifically the negative health impact that they were causing. The Tom's model works by donating a single pair of shoes to a single child in need. And maybe those shoes last for about 6 months before the kid grows out of them. In countries like Argentina, though, oftentimes children have developed calluses on the bottom of their feet to help them deal with the environment that they are barefoot in. While the child is wearing their free pair of Tom's shoes, they lose those calluses. And by the end of the 6 months, their feet are now susceptible to infections and disease like tetanus. Now, I firmly believe that Blake's intentions in founding Tom's Shoes were good. But the impact that Blake and Tom's were having was a more complicated story. So what could Blake have done differently? That was at the heart of my fear in starting my own venture. How do I avoid making these same mistakes? Since this question has been top of mind for me throughout the formation of my venture, I have developed some ways over the past couple years that I or anyone else interested in solving a problem can align the intention that we have with the impact that the world receives. The first rule of how not to ruin the world with your good intentions is to start with the problem, not the solution. If our goal at the end of the day is to solve a problem, then our commitment is to the problem itself and not to any one predetermined solution. Sometimes, at first glance, one thing appears to be the issue. But as people with good intentions, it is our duty to look beyond that initial glance, to do the research and figure out whether we're addressing a problem or merely a symptom. The reality is that shoelessness, though it can certainly be harmful, is a symptom and not a problem. If Blake had taken the time to research the fundamental issues that were underlying these communities in Argentina, Tom's would have likely been a completely different business altogether. If Blake wanted to tackle health, then addressing an issue like malnutrition would have had a larger impact. Or if Blake wanted to create more educational opportunities and focus his energies there, Blake might have likely encountered some studies showing that lack of access to sanitary napkins is one of the leading causes of girls missing school. At the end of the day, there are these key critical issues that are underlying any community's challenges. And it's not to say that shoelessness is an issue that's not worth addressing. But if our goal is to maximize our impact, then we have to make sure that we're focusing on the problem in order to do that. Applying this concept to my startup, Sulis, our team established a North Star of addressing lack of access to clean water. So our commitment was to that need and not to the technology that we developed that we believed could address that need. So if somewhere along the way we figured out that our technology was not an effective solution for addressing lack of access to clean water, then we should not just push forward and try to sell as many of our devices as possible. As soon as you realize that your intention is not aligned with your impact, you need to go back to the problem, back to that North Star, and attempt another strategy. In entrepreneurship, we call this pivoting. But typically, a startup will pivot because they believe that their current tactics are not profitable. Well, I would like to make the case to each and every one of you today that regardless of the profitability of your policy, your initiative, your project, or your venture, if you know in your heart that your idea is not going to effectively solve the problem, or that it's going to cause all types of other unintended consequences, then that is reason enough to pivot. This is not an easy thing to do by any means, But if we're serious about solving these problems, it's what we have to do in order to not ruin the world. So that's rule number 1. Start with the problem, and if we do that, we'll be able to maximize our impact. The second rule of how not to ruin the world with your startup, with your good intentions, is the power of proximity. Understand that the people who are the experts on the issues you're trying to solve are the ones who experience those problems directly. More often than not, as problem solvers, we go into a situation already thinking that we have the answer, and we're merely looking to others to confirm our theories and suspicions. But if we're serious about solving problems, the first thing we need to do is go to the people experiencing those problems and ask them as many questions as we can. Questions like, can you tell me how you're experiencing this problem? And what options do you have available to you today? And why do you believe that past attempts to solve these problems have failed? And then we need to listen, really listen, internalize, and process. In addition to being a student of entrepreneurship, I'm also a student of social justice, which has taught me that these communities have a lot more to offer us than just the answers to those initial questions. We have to be working in genuine partnership with these communities, because partnering with communities is the best way we can ensure we're mitigating the risk of harming those same communities. If Blake had talked to the people in Argentina about how they thought we should be tackling the issue of shoelessness, they likely would have included themselves in the solution, and he wouldn't have been left in the position that he was of kicking people out of their jobs. To apply this concept, to bring it back to Sulis, right, the startup, we developed a technology as a team that we thought could address lack of access to clean water. But through conversations with our community partners and with families on the ground, we realized that our technology was not going to be an effective method of solving that problem. They told us they needed a solution that was more scalable, that could meet the needs of individuals, families, and communities alike. They needed to know that that water being produced was going to be clean 24/7, 365 days a year, regardless of the weather outside or the time of day. We never would have learned any of that had we stayed inside of our US bubble. But I'm gonna level with you all, problem solver to problem solver. None of what they told us was what we wanted to hear, but we did hear them. And then we were faced with making the toughest decision that we had to make as a startup. Do we launch our business with our initial technology as we were being pressured and advised to do by our mentors, investors, and friends? Well, rule number 2 told me no. We prioritize those with proximity to the problem, we pivot to impact, and we go back to the drawing board to craft a technology that meets their real needs. And that's exactly what we did. Now, 2 whole years later, we've finalized a product design that we believe can address their lack of access to clean water in a way that meets their needs. And that's only been possible because we've worked with our partners in India every step of the way. That is the power of proximity. And the third rule of how not to ruin the world with your good intentions is to keep your feedback loop open. We all experience this notion of confirmation bias. We spend time with our ideas, we love our ideas, and the further along we get into implementing those ideas, the less and less we want to hear what the world is telling us, that sometimes our ideas have real negative impact. That is why it is so important to continue having frequent conversations and interactions with your community partners, even after you've initially launched your idea, venture, or business. As problem solvers, we do not have the luxury of assuming that an idea that met an initial set of needs is still an effective solution, because contexts are ever changing. When we do go and launch Sulis with this new product design, we're going to need to keep our feedback loop open. We have to continue to track our impact metrics, and then we need to adjust our efforts accordingly. I have to go back to Daksha and ask her, is our solution meeting your needs now? And what's changed in both good and bad ways since we launched Sulis? Sulis, like all ventures born out of good intentions, has to put systems in place that hold our impact accountable to the intention behind it. But our feedback loop extends beyond just the community partners. We all need people in our lives, like friends, mentors, family, that are going to hold us accountable to our word. It is so crucial that we have these people in our lives so that we don't reach a point 30 years down the line where you're an entrepreneur who's amassed millions of dollars or a policymaker at the end of their career, and you're only just starting to realize now all of the negative impact that's come out of your life's work. Now that we have our 3 rules, I want to leave you with one final message, and that is that it's never too late to start implementing these guidelines in order to align the intention that we have with the impact that the world receives. Many of us in the room today are young and are at the beginning of our careers, and so in my ideal world, we would all go out and live by these 3 rules. But some of us in the audience are in the middle of our careers or towards the end. Regardless of your experience, there are always ways we can be incorporating these principles into how we address the problems we face every day. Take, for example, Blake. Yes, that Blake from Tom's Shoes. He did, in fact, keep his feedback loop open. He heard the negative criticisms that people were making of Tom's Shoes. Not only did Blake acknowledge the unintended consequences, but as the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, he did something very rare, admitted that he was wrong. And then he took action to remedy the negative economic impact. Blake moved those factories that were producing the shoes getting donated into countries like Argentina in order to put jobs back into those local economies. But wait, wasn't there a second negative criticism? What about the negative health? Well, I wish that I could wrap this up in a neat little bow and tell you all that that issue and that criticism had been fully addressed as well. But the reality is that the balance of negative consequences will rarely, if ever, equal 0 when you're trying to face a global problem. But we cannot allow that to stop us from going out and acting on our good intentions. Tom's Shoes has been able to expand their reach beyond just shoes. They've been able to provide eyesight restorations for 780,000 people, and they've donated $6.5 billion to organizations that they believe are building a better tomorrow. None of that would have been possible if fear of negative consequences had stopped Blake from donating that first pair of shoes. We owe it to Daksha, to each other, and to ourselves to go out and act on our good intentions. But while we're doing that, we have to keep our 3 guidelines in mind. Start with the problem, not the solution, harness the power of proximity, and keep our feedback loops open. And if we do all 3 of those things, I firmly believe we'll be able to use our good intentions to build a better world. Thank you.